Cattle Baron chose the penniless girl with a limp over 7 beauties. The deed was in my left hand, and I hadn't moved in 3 minutes. Not because I was thinking about it. I'd already thought about it plenty, the way you think about a thing so long it stops meaning anything, just shapes on paper, just black marks somebody made once in a county office that smelled like tobacco and old wood. What held me was the window. The glass was old, rippled at the edges the way they used to make it, and through that glass the whole valley was laid out like something God had set down and walked away from, green in the creek bottoms, brown going gold on the ridges. The Dunmore herd moving slow across the south pasture, their backs catching light, maybe 300 head from where I stood, though I knew it was closer to 8. 41 years I'd been building toward that window. My father didn't own a saddle when he came to this country. I want you to understand that. Not a saddle, not a horse, not $10. He had a coat and 2 shirts, and he spoke 4 words of English. He died on 40 acres of hardpan that never gave him much. I buried him in the fall of 1879, the year I turned 22, and I stood at that grave and I told him I was going to make something out of the ground he couldn't, not out of spite. Out of the particular grief a son carries when a good man's life didn't add up to what it ought to have. I made something. You want to know what it costs? I'll tell you. It costs everything that isn't the work. Costs sleep, costs ease, costs the kind of sitting, still that other men do on a Sunday porch. I married once in 1884, Cecilia. She was a good woman and she tried, and I was not home enough, and she died of a fever in 89 before we'd figured out how to be married right. I don't say that to make you feel sorry for me. I say it because I want you to understand the arithmetic of the thing. I was 53 years old, standing at that window with a deed in my hand, and I had a valley and 800 head and a house with 6 rooms, and I ate alone every night at a table that could seat 12. That's the arithmetic. The 7 women, that was Doris Hartwell's idea, not mine, and I want that on the record. Doris ran the hotel in Calverton, and she'd known me since I was young and broke, and she had always taken a particular interest in my personal arrangements the way some women do when they decide a man's life needs managing. She came to me in March, maybe a week after I turned 53, and she sat down across my desk like she owned the chair, and she said, "Wade, you are going to die alone in this house, and it is a waste, and I will not have it." I told her I wasn't dying yet. She said that wasn't the point. What she had in mind, she'd been corresponding with women back east. Widows mostly, and some unmarried women of a certain age. Respectable, she said. Good families, she said. One of them a schoolteacher from Philadelphia. One a judge's widow from St. Louis. She showed me letters. They were written in a clear hand, these women, and they said the right things, and Doris watched my face while I read them the way you watch a horse deciding whether to trust a fence. I told her I'd think on it. She came back in April and I hadn't thought on it, not really, and she knew that, so she arranged a gathering. A supper. My house, my table that could seat 12, 7 women who'd come west on her assurance that I was worth the trip. I said I wouldn't do it, and she said they were already on the stage, and I owed them a meal at minimum, and that was the kind of argument you couldn't answer without sounding like something low. So there were 7 women at my table on a Thursday evening in late April. I remember the candles. Doris had brought them beeswax, and they smelled like a church. The women were dressed for the occasion, every one of them, and they were, most of them, handsome in the way of women who have learned to present themselves well. The Philadelphia schoolteacher had good eyes, and she asked me a sharp question about the territorial water rights dispute that showed she'd done her reading. The judge's widow from St. Louis wore a dress that cost what a man makes in 2 months, and she spoke to me like I was a reasonable prospect, which I suppose I was. There was a banker's daughter from Kansas City who laughed at the right moments. A woman from Denver who had ranching in her blood and talked about cattle like she meant it. I sat at the head of my table, and I was polite, and I poured wine, and I answered questions, and by 8 o'clock I knew none of it was going to come to anything. Not because the women weren't fine. They were fine. Most of them were finer than I deserved, probably, if you were making that kind of calculation. It was something else. I kept looking at them and thinking, you came here because Doris wrote you that I had a valley and 800 head, and that's fair. A woman looking for a good life ought to go where a good life is possible. I don't blame them for that reasoning. But somewhere in that reasoning I had turned into a piece of the scenery. The valley was the thing. The herd was the thing. I was just the man who was attached to them. I'd felt that before. Not from women, from men, from neighbors, from people in town who treated me like the land treated me, which is to say they respected what I represented and didn't much look past it. It is a lonely thing to be valued mainly for what you have built. I had learned not to say so, because a man in my position saying such a thing sounds like complaint, and nobody has patience for a rich man's complaints. But I felt it that Thursday evening acutely, and I was polite through dessert, and I rode out to check on the South Herd at 9 o'clock just to be somewhere that didn't have candles and expectation in it. Nora Voss I met on a Tuesday. She was at the general store in Calverton, which I was passing through on my way back from the cattle broker's office, and she was having a disagreement with Cal Pruitt, who ran the counter. Not loud, she wasn't a loud person, but firm. She was trying to buy flour and salt and possibly one other thing, and she was several cents short, and Cal Pruitt was telling her that in a voice he used for people he'd already decided about. I know that voice. I'd heard it used on my father once, years ago, when my father's English was still thin, and his coat was worn through at the elbows. I paid the difference without making a thing of it, put the coins on the counter and nodded at Cal and walked to the back to look at the harness stock I'd actually come in for. I wasn't trying to be noticed. It was 3 cents or 4 cents, I don't remember which. She was waiting outside when I came out. I almost walked past her because I wasn't expecting it. She was standing just to the side of the door, her back straight, holding her small parcel with both hands, and she said, "I'd like to pay you back, mister. I don't take charity." I looked at her then properly. She was somewhere around 40, maybe a year or two either side. Brown hair going to gray at the temples. Not soft, her face had the particular quality of a person who has worked hard and slept cold and come through something. Her eyes were a dark gray, almost the color of a winter sky before it breaks, and they were looking at me the way very few people ever looked at me, which is to say straight at my face without calculating anything behind them. She wasn't thinking about my acreage. She was thinking about the 3 cents and her pride. She'd walked to town, I could tell from her boots, 3 miles at minimum, and she walked with a limp, her left hip, something old, the way it had been for a long time, and she'd arranged herself around it. I told her she didn't owe me anything. She said she did. I said what she could do was tell me her name, if she felt a need to square things. She said Nora Voss. And then, because she was that kind of woman, she said, "I'm staying at the Calder place west of town while the family's back east, keeping the stock. If you come by there, I'll have 3 cents waiting." I told her I didn't need 3 cents. She said, "I know you don't, but I do." And she picked up her parcel and she walked off down the street, left hip catching on every third step, and I stood on the porch of the general store in Calverton feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anything romantic, not yet. Something more foundational. The sensation of having been spoken to by a person who was talking to me. I thought about that on the ride home. I told myself I was being foolish. She was a woman keeping someone else's stock, staying in someone else's house, short on flour money. I had 7 women's letters in a box in my study, women with educations and good families and sensible futures, and one of them at least was still waiting on my answer. What was I doing thinking about a gray-eyed woman with a limp who didn't want my 3 cents? But I thought about the eyes. I went back on Friday. I told myself it was because I had business on the west side of the valley. This was partially true. I did have fencing to check. I went past the Calder place on the way, which added maybe 15 minutes to the ride. Nora Voss was in the corral with a gray gelding that didn't want to be shod, and she was talking to it in a low, steady voice while she held its near foreleg and waited for it to decide. She didn't look up when I rode in. The horse was the more pressing matter. I got down and waited by the gate. After a while, the horse let her work, and she nailed the shoe and cleaned up her tools, and then she came to the gate, and she looked at me with exactly the same directness as before, no more and no less, and she said, "I was wondering if you'd come." I asked why. She thought about it. She said, "You looked like someone who finishes what he starts." I didn't know what to say to that. Nobody had said something like that to me in a long time. She had the 3 cents in her apron pocket. She held them out on her palm. I took them. Not because I wanted the money, but because she needed to give them, and I understood that, and I put them in my vest pocket where I could feel them. I stayed an hour. We talked about the Calder stock, 6 horses, 2 mules, a dairy cow she said was giving half of what she ought. I told her what I thought about the cow's feed situation, and she listened and disagreed about one part of it, and she was right about the part she disagreed about. I noticed that she disagreed without hedging it, just said her piece and let it stand, which was not how most people talked to me. They generally looked to see if I was satisfied before they committed to a position. On the way home I thought, "What is wrong with you, Wade Dunmore?" But I came back the next week. We started talking the way two people talk when they are both past the age for performance. Not about everything at once, piece by piece. She told me about her husband, who died 6 years prior of something in his chest that the doctor couldn't name. She told me he'd been a good man who worked hard and the farm they had up north had gone to debt after he died. The kind of debt that compounds itself no matter how hard you work. And she'd sold what was left and come south looking for work, and she'd been keeping other people's homes and stock for 4 years. She said this without asking for sympathy. She was telling me a thing that had happened, the way a person reports weather. I told her about Cecilia. I told her about my father and his 40 acres of hardpan. I told her about the year I was 30 and broke, and I'd had to go to Samuel Garrett's bank and ask for a loan, and Samuel Garrett had looked at me across his desk like I was something he wasn't sure about. I don't know why I told her that last thing. I hadn't told anyone that. But she listened the way she'd listened about the cow's feed, attentively, without performing attention, and when I was finished, she said, "He was wrong about you." Just that, not embroidered, not softened. "He was wrong about you." I had to look out at the pasture for a minute. We talked 6 more weeks like that. Tuesdays and Fridays mostly, sometimes a Wednesday if I had legitimate business in that direction, which I increasingly manufactured. I want to be honest about that. I started finding reasons. There was always something to check on the West Road if you were willing to look for it. What I was learning was something particular about Nora Voss. She was not soft, she was not easy, she was not what anyone would have called a beauty in the conventional way those words get used. But she had a quality I can only describe as this: she was real. Entirely without performance real. When she said something she had thought it first. When she was uncertain she said so. When she disagreed she said that too. And when she looked at me, here is the thing I could not get past. When she looked at me she was looking at a man, not a cattle baron, not an acreage, not a name with a value attached to it. She looked at me the way you look at a person you are trying to understand, because the person interests you. I had not been interesting to anyone in a long time. I mean that in the specific sense. People were interested in my decisions. What I'd do about the water dispute, what I'd pay for a yearling, how I'd vote on the county matter. My opinions were solicited, my positions studied, my temper monitored. But the person underneath all that machinery, the man my father had raised, the man who'd been young once and scared, the man who still kept in his vest pocket 3 cents he didn't need, that person nobody was particularly curious about. Nora was curious. It is a more powerful thing than I had understood. The thing with Doris Hartwell came to a head in June. She stopped me on the main street in Calverton on a Wednesday morning, and she asked me plainly, had I made any progress, and I told her honestly that I thought the supper in April had been a mistake, and she looked at me the way she'd been looking at me since I was young, which was with the expression of a woman who loves you and thinks you are making a mess of your life. She said, "Is there someone else, Wade?" I said it wasn't like that. She said, "The woman at the Calder place." I didn't say anything. She said, "Wade Dunmore, you are a stubborn man, and sometimes that serves you and sometimes it doesn't, but I will tell you what I think. I think you have been alone so long you forgot that a good life has people in it. And I think if you let that woman leave Calverton without saying what you ought to say, you will be sorrier than you know." I told her I appreciated her concern. She said, "I know you do. Now go do something about it." I did not go do something about it immediately. I thought about it for a week, the way I thought about major decisions on the ranch, meaning I turned it over from every angle and mostly convinced myself there were good reasons to wait. The good reasons were, I was 53. She was, as best I could calculate, around 40. She had survived a hard run of years and built herself a self-sufficient life, not comfortable but hers, and I was about to walk into that life with my house with 6 rooms and my 800 head, and ask her what, to give up what she'd kept of herself to become an appurtenance of Wade Dunmore's operation. That was not something I was willing to do to her. But I kept coming back to this. I had not said anything to her, not one word about what I felt, and she was a woman who dealt in plain speech, and she deserved plain speech. She came to the valley on a Sunday. I had asked her if she wanted to see the south pasture, the way you ask when you have something else to say and you need neutral ground to say it on. She'd looked at me with those winter sky eyes and said, "All right." We rode out in the early morning before the heat built, she on the gray gelding she'd shot herself, me on the roan I'd had 4 years. She rode well. Her limp didn't translate to the saddle. On horseback she was level and easy, no compensation visible, and I found that right then for no reason I could name I was looking at her and thinking, this is a competent, able, serious woman. This is someone who has managed what life handed her without bitterness and without losing herself. There was something about that reached me in the chest. The south pasture in June was a particular thing. The creek was still running, and the grass was heavy, and the herd moved slow and steady in the low light. I pulled up at the ridge and we sat for a while, and I told her the history of it, how I'd bought the first piece in the spring of '80, how the drought of '86 had nearly finished me, the winter that killed a third of the herd, and I'd thought that was it. I told her these things because she asked, and because she asked as a person who wanted to understand, not as a person gathering data. She said, "You rebuilt after the winter." I said, "Yes." She said, "I thought so." I looked at her. She said, "There's something about the way you talk about the hard years. You don't skip them. Most men who have done what you've done, they tell you about the success and they go quiet around the parts that were bad. You don't do that." I said I didn't see the point in skipping them. She said, "That's what I mean." We sat quiet for a bit. The herd moved below. The creek made its sound. I said, "Nora, I want to say something and I want to say it plain." She turned on her horse and she looked at me. I said, "I have been coming to the Calder place for 2 months on increasingly spurious pretexts, and I think you know that, and I know you know that, and I would like to stop pretending I have business on the West Road. I am not good at this. I spent a long time not doing it, and I've gotten worse, probably. But what I want to say is, I think you are the most honest person I have encountered in 20 years, and I think you see me in a way that most people in this valley do not. And I am 53 years old, and I have a house with 6 rooms, and I eat alone every night, and I would like, if you are willing, to not do that anymore." She was quiet long enough that I started to think I had made a significant error. Then she said, "I have $3.40 to my name. I have a limp I've had since I was 19. I'm not young. I'm not what those women at your supper were. You should know all of that." I said I knew all of that. She said, "And you're sure?" I said, "Nora, those 3 cents in my pocket are the only things anyone has given me in a long time that I was sure about." She looked at me for what felt like a long time, a full look, the way she always looked, nothing hidden in it and nothing calculated, and then she leaned her horse close to mine and she put her hand on my jaw, just her hand. The way you touch something you want to be sure is real. Her palm was rough from work and warm from the morning sun, and she held my face for a moment and looked at me, and there was something in her eyes I cannot fully describe to you except to say that it was recognition. Not of the valley, not of the house or the herd or the name. She was looking at the man, the one underneath all of it, the one my father had raised on 40 acres of hardpan, and she was telling me with that look that she saw him, that she'd seen him for a while. I put my hand over hers. We sat like that for a minute, maybe 2, above the south pasture in the June light, and below us the herd moved easy through the good grass. She said, "I'll need to finish out the month at the Calder place." I said that was fine. She said, "And I won't be managed." I said, "I know that." She said, "Good." We got married in August at the courthouse in Calverton with Doris Hartwell as witness. Doris cried. She would tell you she didn't, but she did. Nora wore a dress the color of sage, and she did not carry flowers because she had said flowers at a courthouse in the middle of the week seemed like a lot of performance for a practical occasion. I told her I agreed. The judge who married us was a man named Pryor who had known me 20 years, and he shook my hand afterward and looked at Nora and said, "You've done better than you know, ma'am." Nora looked at him steadily and said, "I know exactly what I've done." That was the moment I understood, in the full way you understand a thing, that she was not making a calculation. She was not taking stock of the land or the cattle or the name. She had looked at me, the actual man, and decided that man was worth something. Worth her 3 cents of pride. Worth her plain speech. Worth getting on a horse and riding out to the south pasture to hear the history of a hard 30 years and pay it honest attention. I want you to understand what that does to a man. Not the soft version of it. Not the young version where love feels like being held. The version that comes to a man past 50 who has built something real and earned a respect that doesn't quite reach him, who has eaten alone at a long table and stood at a window with a deed in his hand, feeling the peculiar loneliness of having everything except being known. To have a woman look at that man, specifically, with full knowledge of what he is and what he isn't, and put her hand on his jaw and say with that look, "Yes, you, not the valley, not the herd. You." That does something. It does something I don't have the exact words for, though I've had years to think about them. It restores something, not something lost. I don't want to be too romantic about it. Something that had been there all along, under the work, under the building, under the long-held habit of needing nobody. Some original version of the man that the world mostly doesn't bother to find. She found it. The house doesn't have 6 empty rooms anymore. It has her books on the shelf that was bare. She brought 7 books, and 3 of them are about animal medicine, which I did not expect and which I respect. It has the smell of her cooking in the morning, which is a good smell, nothing fancy but real. It has the sound of her moving around in the early dark when she gets up before me, which she always does, and sometimes I lie still in the bed, and I just listen to that sound, her footsteps on the floorboards, the creak of the kitchen door, and I think about my father on his 40 acres, and I think he would have liked her. He would have known exactly what she was. She keeps 3 cents on the windowsill of the kitchen, in a small tin like there's something valuable. I never asked her why. I think I know why. The valley looks the same through that old rippled glass. Brown going gold on the ridges, green in the creek bottoms, the Dunmore herd in the south pasture, their backs catching light. It's the same view I had when I was 53 with a deed in my hand, and the particular quiet of a house that holds only one person. But I don't stand at the window alone anymore. She comes up beside me sometimes in the morning, her coffee cup in both hands, and she looks out at the same country, and she doesn't say anything about it. Doesn't say it's beautiful, doesn't say anything. She just stands there, and I stand there, and the valley is there, and that is enough. That is, I would tell you, more than enough. It is everything the arithmetic was missing.